In this presentation, I'd like to discuss whether the two humanoid figures on this artifact from Kuntillet Ajrud are best interpreted as representations of Yahweh and the goddess Asherah. The primary reason for identifying these two figures in this way is the inscription overhead, inscription 3.1, which in part reads, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and Asherah, which is probably best translated as his Asherah. Many have interpreted this inscription as a kind of caption for the two humanoid figures beneath it. But let me just mention 5 reasons as to why this interpretation has largely fallen out of vogue amongst commentators. 1. While inscription 3.1 mentions Yahweh and Asherah, there are, in point of fact, not 2, but 3 painted figures underneath the inscription. 2. Pithos A, who offered what we might call the official analysis of these artifacts, made a strong case, I think, that the two figures are representations not of Yahweh and Asherah, but of an Egyptian daimon known as Bes, and perhaps a feminine version known as Beset. Here are some photos of Bes amulets and other artifacts. Note that this daimon had a very stereotyped form, always depicted as facing forward and usually with a stern-looking or leonine face, with his arms akimbo, dressed in a short skirt or just totally naked, and wearing a feathered headdress, and having a tail dangling between his or her legs. And yes, it's a tail, not a penis. Keep that in mind for later. 3. Inscription 3.1 on Pithos A and inscription 3.6 on Pithos B overlap at certain points with the paintings, suggesting either that the scribe was careless, or more likely, that we're not dealing here with some unified or organized composition, such that the inscriptions and the paintings can be understood as relating to one another in some obvious way. 4. Multiple individuals appear to have been responsible for producing the paintings and inscriptions on Pithos A and B, and this again suggests that we're not dealing here with organized or unified compositions, but with more loosely connected elements. And then 5, it's plausible that the paintings on the Pithoi were rough sketches for the murals on the plastered walls of the buildings. If this is true, then we can't assume that the Pithos artwork and the inscriptions can be understood in isolation from the murals. As Talay Ornan puts it, only the study of the wall paintings and the Pithoi together as one assemblage can provide a meaningful comprehension of the decor program of Ajrud. The problem, of course, is that hardly anything of the wall murals has survived, so interpreters can really only speculate about what was on them. I realize that there are counter-arguments to all of these points, so let me address a few of those. Here I'll be interacting primarily with 2 lengthy articles by Ryan Thomas. Against my first point, Thomas argues that the seated figure is a, quote, duplicate or mythological variant of the standing female. As support for this interpretation, he points to certain similarities between these two figures. But to my mind, what stand out more than the similarities are the differences, since the seated figure is not Bes-like, but human, featuring a more rounded head, hair, normal joints in the legs rather than hock joints, and no headdress. Ornan thinks that the seated figure was part of a rough draft for a wall mural depicting a royal banquet. She and others have suggested that the seated figure can in fact be associated with one of the preserved murals, such as this one, wall painting number 9. Attempting to counter my second point, Thomas argues that for many nations of the Iron II period, Bes images and Bes symbolism were used to represent many local tutelary deities, such as Horus of Egypt, Melkart of Phoenicia, Heracles of Cyprus, unnamed deities of Philistia, and Mithras of Persia. Putting this evidence together with several Bes-related artifacts from Iron to Israel, he proposes that in Levantine iconography, images of Bes, and also Horus, who could be depicted with Bes-like characteristics, were also used to represent Yahweh, the tutelary deity of Israel. This hypothesis is certainly intriguing, but his methodology is highly questionable. For example, he tries to connect these images of a seated figure with a uraeus extending from its mouth and surrounded by 4 flying falcons with these 2 Bes images on the basis of shared symbolism. He also argues that Horus was sometimes represented with Bes imagery. This allows him to associate with Bes several images that don't actually have any distinctive Bes features. But even if we grant this methodologically questionable approach, I don't think that Thomas demonstrates that Yahweh could be depicted with Bes or Bes-like images. None of the images that he references actually demonstrates this, since they can be interpreted in any number of other ways. For example, some may be representations of a solar deity, like Shamash or Horus Re. Others may be lesser beings, like angels, cherubs, or protective spirits. Still others may represent human kings. Using Thomas's logic, one could almost identify any amulet that has imagery of Bes or Horus as a depiction of Yahweh. Now, just one illustration here of why I think Thomas's methodology is so questionable. He acknowledges that Horus and Bes rarely occur as theophoric elements in inscriptions from Iron II. By contrast, the name Yahweh absolutely predominates. But rather than seeing this as a strike against his thesis, he interprets it as further support. The absence of evidence here, in his view, is due to the popular assimilation of Horus and Bes with Yahweh. And so rather than people naming themselves after Horus and Bes, they just always use the name Yahweh. This explanation seems all too convenient, however, and question-begging. Thomas also interprets certain amulets with wadjet eyes and pataikos figures, both of which were prevalent in southern Canaan during Iron II, as representations of Yahweh. But he only shows thematic connections here with Bes and Horus, not Yahweh. In short then, Thomas's attempt to link several Egyptian-themed images or inscriptions in ancient Israel or Canaan with Bes or Horus, and then to link these with Yahweh, is methodologically problematic and unconvincing. Against my third point, Thomas notes that inscription 3.6 on Pithos B overlaps with this unfinished bull at precisely the beginning of Yahweh's name. This, in his view, suggests that the scribe was identifying Yahweh with the bull. In other words, the scribe was indicating that this bull was a theriomorphic representation of Yahweh. The overlap also explains why the bull overlaps with the head and the neck of the final worshiper, since this overlap implies that the 5 or 6 worshippers are directing their worship to Yahweh of Timon. But I think Thomas's reasoning here is quite strained. If the scribe wanted to identify the unfinished bull with Yahweh, why make the overlap occur only with the letters Lamed and Yod, and not with the 2 or more letters of the divine name, Yod He Vav He? There would have been plenty of space for that. He could have fit the entire divine name on the bull's body. So why would he have written 3 of the 4 letters down here, where none of them even connects with the bull? Again, if this full-grown bull with horns was meant to represent Yahweh, this wouldn't fit very well with Thomas's interpretation of this hornless, Bes-like figure on Pithos A, which, as we'll see, he interprets as another theriomorphic representation of Yahweh. Against my fourth point, Thomas argues that the number of artists who worked on the Pithoi drawings were fewer than Beck and others have supposed, and that these artists, in any case, could have been working in tandem with one another, collaborating on what they intended to be a unified composition. Some of what Thomas argues here is reasonable enough. For example, the fact that a larger brush size was used on the best figures doesn't necessarily imply that they were created by a different artist. That said, I think that there's still good reason to believe that multiple individuals were responsible for producing the artwork and inscriptions on these Pithoi. And I also think that these individuals were sometimes chronologically far removed from one another. Most notably, since inscription 3.1 is written in red, the same color as the best-like figure with which it overlaps, this suggests that by the time the inscription was added, the painting had sufficiently faded so as to allow the writing to stand out at the place where it overlaps with the painting. Presumably, the painting would have needed at least a few years to fade like this, so it seems unlikely that the artist who added the inscription was working in tandem with the individuals who produced the paintings. As support for his thesis that the artwork and the inscriptions on the two Pithoi constitute united compositions, Thomas offers several other proposals. Most notably, at least for our purposes, he interprets all the bovine elements on both Pithoi as theriomorphic representation of Yahweh and his Asherah. We've already seen how he tries to connect the name Yahweh on inscription 3.6 with this oddly placed bull. He also argues that these two best-like figures on Pithos A, which again he interprets as Yahweh and Asherah, are depicted as having bovine rather than the leonine features that are typically found on other best images. This allows him to draw a further thematic link between these best figures and this nursing cow and calf. Well, but once again, I think that Thomas's analyses of these matters are open to some criticisms. First, if the nursing cow and calf were intended as theriomorphic representations of Yahweh and Asherah, this would imply that Asherah was envisaged not as Yahweh's wife or consort, but as mother. Second, most of Thomas's supposed bovine features on the two best-like figures could just as well be interpreted as leonine. For example, the rectangular oblong head, the elongated snout, and the supposed hock joints on the back legs. Third, if the artist had wanted the two best-like figures to have bovine features, he could have easily communicated this by depicting them as having horns and hooves, especially since the nursing cow on Pithos A and the other two bovines on Pithos B do have horns and hooves. Thomas attempts to evade this horn dilemma, pardon the pun, by interpreting the two best-like figures as calves rather than adult bovines. But even as calves, they could have been depicted with budding horns. Moreover, since Thomas interprets the nursing cow over here as the more thoroughgoing theriomorphic representation of Asherah, we should have at least expected her to be depicted with horns, in order that the two figures might be better matched. Okay, and there's another argument that's often made by those who interpret the best-like figures on Pithos A as Yahweh and Asherah. If you look at the early line drawings by Beck, you'll see appendages dangling between the legs of both figures. In keeping with Beth's iconography, she interpreted these as tails, not penises. You can see from any number of Beth's images outside of Kuntillet Ajrud that this is undoubtedly what the appendages were meant to represent. However, it's now generally thought that the shorter of the two best-like figures on Pithos A didn't have an appendage. Unlike Beck's original line drawing, which she published while she was still alive, the one that was republished in the final excavation report by Zeev Meshel depicts the best figure on the right as having no appendage between its legs. Nothing besides this has been altered about Beck's original line drawings. Meshel explains that when the Pithos was first discovered, it still had a light coat of black soot on it. Over time, that black soot began to fade, and eventually revealed that Beck's supposed appendage was in fact missing. Many have taken this as evidence that the appendage on the other Bess figure must be a penis after all. Thomas even goes so far as to say that the curved lines to the left of the appendage is a scrotum, which is kind of odd because then there's no other scrotum on the other side. For Thomas and other interpreters, this phallic interpretation of the appendage reinforces the idea that the two figures were Yahweh and Asherah. Yahweh, in this way of thinking, was envisaged as a male fertility god whose large genitalia represented male virility. Meanwhile, the other Bess figure, since she lacks the dangling appendage, must be Asherah, the wife or consort of Yahweh. Bear in mind here that when Beck analyzed this Pithos painting and came up with her line drawing, she had been working directly with the artifact. That's something that nobody can still do because after 1979, all the artifacts from Kuntillet Ajrud were placed in the custody of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Since then, they haven't been accessible to the general public or even to scholars. I don't know when exactly they became inaccessible. Maybe someone in the audience can clarify that for me. I assume it was in 1979 when the artifacts were handed over to the Egyptian authorities. But Beck published her study in 1982, 3 years after that. So I'm a bit confused as to how anyone could have taken better photos or come up with a better analysis than Beck. It seems like she would have been one of the last people to view the artifacts before they were taken into private custody. In any case, though, as I said, nobody at this point has access to the artifacts, so until that changes, we can only try to analyze them by reading the descriptions of people like Beck, who were able to analyze the artifacts firsthand, and by studying the available photographs and line drawings. I myself am convinced that Beck's original analysis was correct. There is a tail between the legs of the smaller Bess figure. The problem is that the paint in this portion of the Pithos is quite smeared and faded. In this respect, it's really no different than other parts of the painting, such as the mouth and the right shoulder, or the abdomen of this other Bess-like figure. But if you look carefully, I believe that the faint markings of a tail are still visible. Here's what I came up with as a provisional enhancement. You may disagree, but it's my contention that the tail is still visible. In conclusion, then, I think it's misguided to interpret these two Bess-like figures as Yahweh and the goddess Asherah. The paintings need to be understood independently of the inscription.